Go ahead, Leah.
Well, good morning, everyone, or shall I say good afternoon. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm delighted to bring together a panel today to discuss the ways that we can begin to incorporate biodiversity into business decision-making, and we're going to dig into the structure and value of partnerships between academia and non-academic organizations, specifically organizations with whom we partner as the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes. I am the director of Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, and I'm also a professor in the School of Life Sciences. And I'm delighted to introduce this wonderful panel. We will hear first from Laura McConnell, who will share experiences from Bayer, working in the agricultural realm. We will then hear from Christian, who is with EPRI, Electric Power Research Institute, and explore ways that the electric power industry can actually make its part in conserving biodiversity or mitigating biodiversity loss. We will then hear from Frank Hawkins, who is the director for the IUCN North America, to discuss some work that is being done to bring together industry, NGOs, and academia to better measure industry contributions to achieving things like the Sustainable Development Goals. And then finally, we will hear from Chris Barton, who is a fellow in the ASU President's Office and also a PhD student in ASU School for the Future of Innovation in Society. So thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to check with Suzanne and Anai to see if there are any logistical announcements that need to be made before we launch right in.
Thank you, Leah. Just a brief announcement: when we get to the Q&A session, participants will have a chance to raise their virtual hand, and then we will unmute your microphone so you have a chance to ask your question. And then you raise your virtual hand by going to the participants icon at the bottom on the menu bar, and then you will see a panel to your right. At the bottom, you'll see the option to raise your hand. If we have any issues with sound, unfortunately, we're going to have to skip to the next question. And we're here if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anai. Can you all see my screen? Okay, well, I made my introductions to the panel before showing this slide, but now you see pictures of who you're seeing pictures of. Before I hand this over, I am going to lay the groundwork a little. Specifically, what I want to do is talk about why biodiversity conservation makes good business sense. And I'm sure you've heard recently that we are, in fact, facing an unprecedented geological era where we've never seen such high extinction rates. So if you look at this map here, there are very few. This is a heat map showing, high impact, both in marine and terrestrial systems. There really are very few places left on the planet that are not impacted by humans. And across different taxonomic groups, ranging from birds to mammals, to amphibians, to plants, we're seeing unprecedented rates of extinction. And this extinction is due to human activity. I had the pleasure of serving as a lead author on the IPBES report. It was a UN Global Assessment for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And in this assessment, we addressed a number of key issues related to the status of biodiversity listed here. What is the status? How does nature contribute to the UN Sustainable Development Goals? What are the plausible futures between now and 2050? What pathways and policy interventions can lead to sustainable futures? And what are the options available to decision makers? So the upshot of 3 years of work and hundreds of authors is that things are not looking very good. Life on Earth is deteriorating at a fast pace across all indicators. the global state of biodiversity is decreasing. In fact, as I mentioned, we are experiencing this unprecedented rate of extinction, and that is higher than any other time in human history. With respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, those goals that are most impacted by biodiversity listed here, selected Sustainable Development Goals, ranging from poverty to clean water and sanitation, climate action. There were no targets within each of these goals that were positive. So we're not doing a very good job at moving towards achieving these global goals. So that sort of lays the foundation for the problem. One driver, in my opinion, of this problem is the mismatch between the needs, the financial needs for recovering biodiversity and the funding. We're essentially not funding conservation. So the amount that's needed globally to support biodiversity conservation or mitigate this unprecedented rate of extinction is about $76 billion per year. In the US, it's about 1.2 billion, and we're spending only about 20% of that. Now, this is important because there was a paper a couple of years ago that shows a very tight correlation between biodiversity loss and conservation spending. So we can actually use this as a predictive relationship to decide where should we invest specifically in improving this rate of decline or mitigating biodiversity loss. So pivoting from the problem to the solution, and really the goal of this, this webinar is to broach this topic of biodiversity conservation for the private sector. And so here's a really rough typology of why companies should invest in biodiversity conservation. And these range from regulatory and policy, operational risks and inefficiencies, access to finance, reputational and stakeholder relations, and market-based approaches. So essentially, what I would like you to walk away with is a strong sense for why biodiversity conservation makes good business sense. And I think we're at the cutting edge or at the forefront of developing the approaches to truly incorporate the financial value of nature into mainstream financial markets and supply chains. So as a flavor for some of the work we do at the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes, a recent review that several of our students conducted looked at across 200 sustainability reports for major companies. How frequently do these reports mention these terms, biodiversity, ecosystem service, and natural capital? So that they're all mentioned. They're mentioned, in fact, 10 or 5 times within the report. So the major companies appear to care, but then there are very few actions outlined in these reports, and largely because there really are no incentives for actions. And there's really no systematic approach to link actions to outcomes. So some of the approaches that we're working on, for example, with the problem of how do we even measure biodiversity? What is a relevant indicator? We bring decision science to work with companies to outline what is the business context, what are the goals, what are the different actions or management actions that we can take. We then can develop the relevant indicators, implement, monitor, and adapt and refine. So this is essentially taking what we call structured decision-making and bringing it into the business context. Now, to zoom in on a piece of that, under the monitoring and evaluation part of this cycle, here's an example of something we're working on with respect to measuring either a country or a company's impact on reporting on how are they contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. So you might have a landscape plus funding the question is, what do we do? Well, in conservation, we have not done a very good job in linking empirical data on what works to actual decisions or actions. So we might choose an action, and in choosing the action, we compile data on the costs and benefits of what works and what doesn't work to choose the action that most likely contributes to the objectives. And then we bring this back to decision makers to deliberate and weigh these options. So that's just a real quick flavor for the type of approach that we take. And throughout this panel, you're going to hear much more detail on the actual types of work we're doing. And I hope to have plenty of time for discussion with the audience. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. And I would love to invite Laura McConnell from Bayer to share her insights and experience in private sector partnerships with academia and what can be achieved in such partnerships. So I will pass it over to Laura.
All right, thanks, Leah. So I will share my screen and my slides. So thanks so much, Leah, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I am really honored to be here today and join in this excellent discussion, which is so important for our planet and for our everyday lives, actually. I just thought I would give you a little bit of background about myself and my career, just to give you an idea where I'm coming from. I did my graduate work at University of South Carolina and looked at persistent organic pollutants in large lakes, like the Great Lakes. And then I moved to the USDA Agricultural Research Service, where I did work on conservation practices to mitigate pollutant transport and provide ecosystem services. And so in 2013, I took a leap and went to Bayer and started working and understanding how the pesticide industry and crop protection industry works and how it's regulated and how it generates very large data sets which get submitted to regulators that govern their use in the environment. And now I'm in a new role on engaging on regulatory issues with universities and scientific societies. And so that just gives you a little bit of background for me. But I did want to mention what an issue that Leah was bringing up is that companies really do see the need for commitments to protecting biodiversity, and not just biodiversity, but reducing the effects of climate change, especially, which will then also reduce pressure on biodiversity loss. And so I just want to mention some commitments that Bayer Crop Science, the part of Bayer that I work for, has made specifically, and that is to reduce environmental impact of crop protection by 30% by 2030, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions produced by our key crops in major markets by 30%, and to empower 100 million smallholder farmers to providing them with access to sustainable agricultural solutions. And so you may say, well, how do you even go about doing that? And that is really a challenge, to actually measure these reductions in a meaningful way. In that way, we have to work with farmers, with stakeholders, with universities, and see, can we really accomplish this? There's not another industry out there, I think, that can have more impact on biodiversity than agriculture. And what we know in working with farmers is that if you make something economically beneficial for them, if they can see the benefit, and also if they can see the benefit to their farm of protecting biodiversity, then it becomes built in to their everyday operations. And that works much better than having to impose regulations on farmers that it's, you know, it's very difficult from farm to farm to implement certain types of regulations. And so I think, you know, these types of commitments require significant innovation. Our company has a lot of innovative scientists working, but we need partnerships with people like Leah in your center to bring additional innovation to our thinking. And so that's one of the reasons why we've partnered with ASU. And so just, you know, thinking a little bit more about this, you know, what is the value of these industry academic partnerships? And so, you know, our company has a huge number of partnerships that have been established with various organizations, but working with ASU, we can definitely extend the reach and visibility of this work. And so I think both sides receive, you know, benefit from these collaborations. And the other part of it is that our university partners can really give us honest feedback and rigorous scientific review on what we're doing. We need that. And, you know, trust is built over time. You can't start from zero when you're tackling a big problem like biodiversity. And so you have to build up trust over time on both sides. And, you know, I can see the potential for a lot of benefit from this collaboration. So, you know, in addition, we want to interact with talented students. And so this is another benefit of those types of partnerships. So, you know, the current project that we are working with ASU is, you know, how do we balance the need for food production, which everyone agrees that's one of the sustainable development goals is nutrition and food for everyone. But then also at the same time balancing the need to protect endangered species, for example, and biodiversity in general. And so you have to balance these things, and how do you make the decision on what direction to go? And so this is where the decision science comes into play. And so we really do appreciate the expertise that ASU Center for Biodiversity Outcomes has brought to this effort. So glad to be here today, and look forward to the Q&A at the end.
Thank you so much, Laura, for those excellent insights. Much appreciated. And if it's okay with all, I'd like to continue and then hold questions for our panel discussion at the end. So next, I would like to introduce Christian Newman with the Electric Power Research Unit. Christian, it's all yours.
Thank you. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good. Sorry, there we go. All right, and let me, I'm going to share my screen. Get this thing going. I want to go with screen 2. Bear with me, I'm almost there. Are we? How does that look? Does that look okay?
No, we cannot see the screen yet. If you go to the bottom, do you see the green button that says share screen?
Yep, hold on.
Okay.
I thought I had done it correctly. Bear with me.
Okay.
Screen 2. I want screen 2. Oh, I have to hit share. All right,
Perfect.
now, there we go. Almost.
Okay, we can see it.
How we go?
Excellent.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to serve on this panel, and I speaking for EPRI, really appreciates the opportunity to work with ASU and this group. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about EPRI. So we're the Electric Power Research Institute, and so our mission is to advance, safe, reliable, affordable, environmentally responsible electricity for society. And so, how did we come about? Well, in the early 70s, there was a huge blackout up in the northeastern states, and and Laura was talking a little bit about this, where the Congress was going to come down on the electric power industry because they were not being proactive in terms of trying to do research to address primarily sort of reliability issues. And so that's where EPRI kind of sprung out of. And it's a very sort of interesting model where we're primarily funded by the electric power industry. So we have many sort of funders and member companies across the U.S. and the world. They're generally the electric power companies in your area, and so we've been able to sort of bring together all of these different sort of groups and to form a collaborative model to try to identify and then to do research for the benefit of the electric power industry, but as well as society. So we're born out of a collaborative model. Sorry, and so we, from the very beginning, we've been engaging with scientists, researchers, and universities, trying to sort of bring sort of the best and the brightest to deal with many of the challenges that the electric power industry faces, but also broadly what society is facing. So we all, most of us, all want energy and need energy, to function, and so as an independent nonprofit, we are sort of leading research in those areas. And so EPRI set up there's a sector doing lots of research around sort of nuclear power, trying to sort of make it safer, better. There's another sort of sector that's focused on just generation in general. So, and again, historically, the electric power companies have been many times focused on coal. In fossil fuels, that is changing very rapidly. And so lots of the electric power companies are moving to renewables, wind and solar. But then there's also a group of utilities that are primarily focused on managing, the wires, the power delivery and utilization, basically sort of getting the power from where it's being generated to the sort of customers. And so there's many types of sort of research going on in that. And then obviously across all of that, there are the questions and issues around environmental sort of impacts and potential sort of benefits from some of these energy choices. And so there's a lot going on with EPRI. We're a very big organization. And so, yeah, and I touched on this already, that we are set up to be a collaborative group focused on trying to create sort of solutions for our sector as well as society. So again, EPRI is a really big organization. I fall within generally this sort of environment group that's kind of strategically placed across all of those other sectors. And then even within that large organization, I'm within a program a group called Sustainability and Ecosystem Stewardship. And so there are 3 programs that, again, the electric power companies put their dollars in to fund research in. And so one is ecosystem risk and resiliency, and that right now is focused a lot on sort of water issues, water risk, climate change, trying to understand how companies can plan for and look forward in terms of managing those kind of risks. And then there's species, which is my program I'll talk about in just a second. But then, you know, in the last 3-4 years, there's one of the biggest and fastest sort of growing programs within EPRI is around strategic sustainability science. And so, you know, I think that, you know, broadly within, you know, companies, there's more and more sort of focus on that. And where in my program, you know, which is a lot of really is sort of driven, sort of created to respond to, you know, regulations. You know, I think there's a broad recognition that that a lot of the drivers now, there are some regulatory drivers, but a lot of it actually has to do with sort of making sure that responding to shareholders and to other sort of societal drivers. And so that's there's a big sort of change in shift in some of the ways in some of the drivers for research. And so my program is very focused on species. And so we break my program up into what I call 3 pillars. So one is, you know, we have to have a better understanding of the species that maybe are not regulated now, and trying to sort of focus on, well, what can we do and what research is needed to better understand those species, to make a better assessment as to whether they may or may not be listed, but then also to be more proactive in terms of trying to, you know, find ways that we can do voluntary conservation actions so that we can keep those species from being listed. But then once a species is listed, then, you know, there's a lot of challenges for companies in terms of complying with the Endangered Species Act. And so many times that comes down to, you know, how can you sort of minimize and mitigate for those effects? And so, you know, we're doing research in that area. And oftentimes a lot of those ways that we can sort of mitigate and avoid and minimize is using different technologies. And so, you know, some, you know, good examples would be, you know, like in the wind industry, we're doing research to try to reduce the impact from birds and bats from, you know, on wind turbines, you know, technology, deterrence, trying to predict when the birds and bats are going to be there. So there's a lot of, EPRI has a long history of using technology to try to sort of address, you know, some of those issues. And then, you know, a key component of it is also trying to sort of reach out to academia and other researchers and other industries, because we face common challenges, and a lot of the solutions that that are sort of needed broadly for species are the solutions that we can all, you know, use together. So that basically is a summary of my program. And so why are we working with ASU? Well, Leah and her group, I mean, they're some of the leading researchers around sort of biodiversity, around some of these species issues. Specifically, you know, what caught our eye was some of the research that they were sort of doing about trying to better understand costs. And so, you know, one of the things that we have found, you know, with our members and with our industry, there's really not a good handle on how much is being spent, you know, on endangered species, and also potential, you know, by understanding some of that, you know, what would be some of the trade-offs of, hey, well, let's invest in this kind of conservation actions now in order to potentially sort of minimize, you know, some of the other effects, you know, downstream. And so, you know, but oftentimes when you think about, you know, voluntary conservation actions or even kind of making decisions, you know, and it's really hard for these companies to justify it without, you know, unfortunately having to justify it to sort of upper management. And a lot of that comes down to costs. And so we are really trying to sort of better understand what the costs are around endangered species. And ultimately, you know, can we translate those risks that these companies are facing into cost? And so we launched a project with ASU 2 years ago, and we're really excited about it, where we're trying to sort of, one, at the base level, trying to characterize what the costs are, but then ultimately, you know, I think that we're going to be able to get to the point where we're going to be able to sort of look at sort of the trade-offs of different costs. And so we are right now in the process of mining what we call habitat conservation plans, which is the type of permitting mechanisms for endangered species. And we're finding a treasure trove of sort of data and information within that. And so, you know, this is a conceptual framework of how we're starting to sort of look at these costs. And so, you know, an asset or a project, you know, has a life. And so there are potential sort of endangered species costs all throughout sort of the life of that project. And so we're trying to characterize what those are, partly so that we can have a better understanding, so we can make sort of better decisions. But ultimately, there may be some opportunities for, enhanced sort of conservation actions instead of spending money in a certain way. And so recently, we were looking at some data, and we found that there's within sort of these habitat conservation plans, we're finding that within some of the industries that more is being spent on monitoring in order to comply with the Endangered Species Act than is actually being spent, on mitigation measures, on compensatory sort of mitigation. And again, there are drivers why we have to sort of do the monitoring, but without sort of having an understanding of those costs, we can't really sort of, we're now in a position we could say, well, is that much monitoring really needed? Would we rather sort of take that money and spend it, on trying to address some of these conservation actions? So anyway, so we're really excited about working with ASU, and they're going to continue our engagement, going forward. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Christian. Brilliant. All right, so moving right along, I would like to introduce Dr. Frank Hawkins, who is the Director and CEO for IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature in North America. Frank.
Thank you very much, Leah. Very good to be with you all. I hope you can hear me okay.
Sorry, Frank, you're showing your email, not the PowerPoint.
Beg your pardon. Sure you don't want to see that. Let's try this one. How does that look? Is that better?
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So thanks very much for having me, for convening this discussion. Very interesting stories so far. I want to take a slightly broader, more global context here, and in particular, looking at the way in which biodiversity is assessed at a global scale and how that relates to international policy instruments, but also how it is that the private sector can interact with biodiversity at that scale as well. So I'm the director of the IUCN Office for North America. IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. That's a union that encompasses about 1,400 conservation NGOs, including all the ones you know and love. And of course, the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes is also a member. But big conservation NGOs like WWF and CI and TNC, all members of IUCN, with a kind of umbrella organization for conservation around the world. But we also have about 90 countries as members as well. So IUCN is a good framework, a good structure within which you can discuss these higher level policy issues, and also look at how it is that the global standards for biodiversity data collection and management can be translated into tools that the membership and the private sector can then use. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the work that we've been doing in partnership with some academic institutions, including ASU, but also some others, to figure out how it is that you can measure impacts of private sector activities and investment on biodiversity. As you all know, but measuring impact on biodiversity, particularly if you're going to do it at a global level, is very hard. Biodiversity has three components. You've got species, genes, and ecosystems, which kind of blend into each other to some extent, but they're quite hard to quantify at a given scale or for a given action. And if you want to measure change in the status of biodiversity, particularly if you're looking at it from a private sector perspective, you need to find a way that allows you to assess impacts in a comparable way across sites. So you can say, my intervention over here is likely to be more, have a more significant impact on biodiversity than my intervention over there, and the here and there could be the opposite sides of the world. And also that you can add the interventions up. So if you have interventions that span a portfolio, or if you have a series of sites where your company is investing across the world, you need to be able to add up impact so you can show what the overall company footprint is. That means that you have to use existing data. You can't go out and collect data about global biodiversity because it's just too complicated. There's lots of people who've been working on the collection of biodiversity data for hundreds of years, and you need to base your metrics on that. And then you have to find a way to assess the impact of your actions at the speed at which you make decisions about investment. That is to say, over relatively short time periods, a year or so, even less. That's a really big challenge, and that's the one we've been wrestling with for a bit. The larger policy context here, of course, is that in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we need to find a way to enable state and non-state actors. That's the way those things are framed in the Global Biodiversity Framework. That is to say, governments and everybody else, how can we contribute together to reducing the loss of biodiversity using a measure that is universal across those constituencies. And the biodiversity equivalent needs to be something that allows you to break up a problem into very small pieces and use a unit to measure it that everybody can get around. And this is the issue for the climate world, where you have a target of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is measured in terms of your ability to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide equivalents. So you need a unit like that that tells you, you could add up those units and say, here it is, how it is we've achieved that target. So within that framework, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we have these things called science-based targets. And these are specific structures, like you have with the climate agreement, that allow people to align themselves in this way. That is to say, how specific actions that people can undertake, lots of different people, undertaken in specific places, can contribute towards a potential global biodiversity target, which, as it's framed at the moment, is to halt loss of biodiversity by 2030 and restore it by 2050. Now, the science-based targets process in the climate world has had enormous uptake. Most of the companies in the world have decided how they're going to contribute to this, certainly the bigger ones. What we need to be able to do is to do the same thing for biodiversity, and that's the challenge we're facing here. So, as I said earlier, you've got to have a target that has to be measurable at all scales, from the site scale to the global scale. It's got to be comparable between sites. It's got to be able to, you have to be able to add it up, so it's so you can calculate a global target, but then you have to break it back down again to show who it is who's contributed to that target. It needs to be able to respond quickly, and in the specific context of biodiversity, you have to be able to show how you've reduced threats to biodiversity, but also contributed to the restoration of biodiversity. And the equivalent, you might imagine a picture where you're seeing the loss of biodiversity as a graph where that path is declining, biodiversity is declining. You need to bend the curve. You need to bend the curve so that it flattens out. But you do that by abating the threats to biodiversity, but then you need to bend the curve back up again, and you do that by restoration. So what we've been doing is a collaboration between the IUCN members, these 1,400, not all of them, but a good selection of IUCN members, the private sector where we're testing these approaches, and academia. And the approach we've developed is based on the IUCN Red List of Species, which is, as I'm sure you know, is a data set that covers species all across the world rather. And we've been road testing this metric across a range of different private sector based collaborations. The approach we have is called the Species Threat Abatement and Restoration Metric. And the way that we assess the contribution that investments can make to reducing species extinction risk around the world is by looking at what those actions, what investments can do to mitigate the existing risk factors. So if you have a species of tree that is being over harvested, then the threat to that tree is overconsumption. Another, a frog might be in danger because of pollution or because of siltation. A bird might be in danger because its habitat's being lost, those things, those sorts of things. And then you can also assess what kind of extinction risk you can reduce by restoring habitats, such as by, for instance, what's happened with pronghorn antelopes or black-footed ferrets in the US. Lots of cases of places where habitat restoration and attempts to captive breed animals have resulted in successful conservation outcomes. And our metric is based on the IUCN Red List of species. There are about 100,000 species around the world that have been assessed for risk of extinction by about 20,000 scientists. And what we do is we calculate a value for a particular site using the species that occur in that site and the threats that apply to it. And what we do is we assess the changes in the threats that are leading to changes in risk of extinction and show how those changes can be positive or negative. Therefore, we can satisfy the conditions that we laid out earlier. We can compare across investment targets. We can say that investing $1 million in a plant in South Africa is less productive of reduction in species extinction risk than investing the same amount of money in a forest in Colombia, for instance. We can add up the potential contributions across a corporate footprint across the world. So you can say, overall, my company is contributing this number of star units to a global target, 0.1% of the global target for species extinction risk reduction within the global biodiversity framework. And we can say that because we've invested this amount of money over this year, we've reduced that threat by 50% in that time period. That is a specific contribution to that target at that site. So what we do with STAR is we use it in 3 phases from the project implementer, from the private sector implementer, if you like, perspective. First of all, you can calculate what we call an estimated ex-ante value for STAR, which is only using existing published information. And that tells you a preliminary evaluation of a site or a landscape or a portfolio to contribute to threatened species conservation, to reducing the risk of species extinction. And in general, in most parts of the world, we have a fairly good idea of what the species that occur there that are threatened with extinction and what processes are going to cause them to be at risk of extinction. You then need to go, if you're planning to implement action in that site, to a baseline phase where you refine that analysis and show the detail of what threats occur within that site and confirm that the species actually occur there and that they're affected by those threats. That gives you a refined, updated, if you like, potential for reducing species extinction risk at a site. And then once you've measured your baseline, you can then show how it is that those actions can deliver you results which will take you towards the target that you set. Say, for instance, over 5 years, you want to reduce the threat to a species by 50%. That's the target you set, and you can measure the extent to which you've done that by assessing the intensity of the threat. The specific collaborations we have within this are particularly with the University of Newcastle, who are leading the Biodiversity Post-2020 Task Force of the IUCN Species Survival Commission, who are developing the methodology, helping us publish the paper, and also working on road testing with a number of companies. With ASU, we're working with the Center for Biodiversity Outcomes and specifically focusing on regions of Colombia to enable those policymakers to assess the extent to which you can deliver species extinction risk reduction with the greatest efficiency in terms of the cost involved. And then with Cornell University, we're applying STAR to show how it is that the finance sector can demonstrate, if you like, a non-financial return on investment by using STAR as a measure of that. So for country level, we're running a demonstration case, a test, using with support from the French government with a project called Biodev 2030, where 15 countries around the world are looking at formulating a target for them and companies that live within that, that work within that country, to deliver model outcomes for the post-2020 biodiversity framework. That is to say, model, I mean that they are ideas of how it is that the company could, the country can formulate a target for the post-2020 framework, and then have companies contribute to it based on their changes in the way they operate within the country. We're doing other road tests at the company level with biodiversity impacts on individual projects. I'll come back to an example in just a second. Looking at commodity sourcing across the fashion industry, looking at specific production practices. So for how it is you can adjust cattle ranching in South America to reduce extinction risk issues. And then looking at ways in which you can adjust threats within production areas to reduce impacts on species. And for finance sector companies, private sector, we're looking at how it is that asset managers can assess their portfolio risk by looking at the companies they invest in and the sectors they invest in and what their dependencies and risks are in terms of biodiversity impacts. So those are the main areas that we're working with STAR at the company level. A very quick look at a site level. This is a sustainable rubber plantation in Indonesia, in Sumatra, and you see the black line here is the edge of the rubber concession. The dotted line is a national park, and the orange area is the area where you can invest most effectively to reduce threats to species extinction, mostly to do with things like forest animals, monkeys, and birds that occur on the edge of the protected area, but also in parts of the concession. And the blue areas are areas where you can invest in restoring forests that will improve the habitat for those threatened species and make it more likely that they will survive, they won't go extinct. Right over in the left-hand side, you can see an area which is bright red where you have a very, very localized bat actually that lives in that area of forest only. That's its entire world distribution, that little patch of forest there, where you can really contribute very substantially to reducing species extinction risk by reducing threats to that species in particular. So this is a level of precision you can get to using STAR that will enable a particular company to focus actions at the site scale, but at the same time show it is how they can contribute to global targets. So that's the end of that little global discourse. We have a paper describing the approach and the methodology that'll be coming out in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, I hope in the next couple of months.
Thanks so much, Frank. That was really interesting. So we've sort of gone from the premise that, you know, companies care, to hearing about what different companies are doing, to taking this global perspective. And our last talk will be Chris Barton, who's going to talk to us about the process of knowledge production to knowledge outcomes, and how do we cultivate this to achieve the outcomes that we're aspiring to achieve. So Chris.
Thanks, Leah. Just let me share my screen here. Can you all see that? Cool. So my name's Chris. I am a fairly recent addition to CBO. My background is actually in international business and sustainability, but I'm currently getting my PhD in global development, kind of focusing on this intersection of private industry and public service outcomes such as biodiversity, protection, development, sustainability. And I want to talk a little bit about the model that CBO is taking to these sorts of partnerships moving forward. So our theory of change is kind of based around this idea of knowledge co-production, which is an idea that has a lot of background. And down there in the corner, you can see a citation that has a lot of info on it. But the idea here is that knowledge is created in collaboration. And there's a couple of really important points here that I want to bring out before we move forward. The first is that inherent in the idea of knowledge co-production is that there's no hierarchy between the partners working together. It's not that science is more important and should inform business or the other way around, but it's a recognition that both science and business constantly shape and influence each other. It's this constant process of one influencing the other back and forth. Co-production is more than translation. It's not that knowledge flows from one sphere, such as academia, into another, such as the business world, or vice versa. It's actually that the knowledge is created in collaboration, in the overlap between the spheres. And we recognize that there are many sources of knowledge, and the way that we understand the world is not necessarily the way that other people understand the world. And the goal is to combine perspectives, not to replace one perspective with another. And so what this kind of all comes down to is the actionable point here is collaboration in knowledge production. So collaboration in identifying problems that we want to look at, identifying the methods of how we want to approach them, collaboration in approaching the problems, and collaboration in implementing the outcomes and the knowledge that we generate. So CBO is focused broadly on kind of 4 outcomes, and I want to talk really briefly about how we look at them and some of the work that we're doing in each of these areas. So the first is what we're calling actionable knowledge. And the issue here is that scientific knowledge can be difficult to find, understand, and use for those who are not part of the scientific community. And so what we're trying to do is create co-produced knowledge that's actionable, accessible, and useful to everyone, regardless of whether or not they've got a scientific background or not. So some of our current work is looking at what individual and institutional best practices are for creating this type of knowledge. And we actually have a paper about to come out in Conservation Science and Practice highlighting exactly this, where we identify a couple of best practices for organizations and a couple of best practices for individuals that together can lead to certain actionable science outcomes and make sure that the knowledge actually gets used. So our second outcome is harmonized tools. And so the issue here is that decision-making tools used in business and decision-making tools used in conservation can suggest contradictory actions. So the goal here is to build tools that integrate business needs with conservation needs. And the STAR framework that Frank was talking about definitely fits into this category. But another thing that we're looking at is how we can enhance business tools that are already in use with insights from conservation to make sure that they do serve both of those outcomes and don't lead to this conflict between conservation and business. An example of this is we took the Porter's 5 forces analysis, which is kind of just like a classic business school theory. And it's a theory about what forces determine why some industries are more profitable than others. So we took that framework, which is already in use in the business world, and added biodiversity into it. Right? So what we have here is the forces, the ways that biodiversity can influence the profitability of a particular business. And I should point out that all of these, if you want to reach out to us later, I'll be happy to send you any of this content so you can look at it more in depth. So our third outcome here is harmonized metrics. So businesses and conservation people value the natural world differently. And so what we're trying to do is develop metrics and valuation methods that capture both business outcomes and conservation outcomes so that we can be speaking the same language. And so some of this work is like, how can businesses develop biodiversity metrics that can be integrated into their operations and aren't just external? And Leah already discussed this earlier, but this is from another article that she has out, which essentially gives a process by which a business can develop metrics, biodiversity metrics that are unique to it and unique to its operations. And so it can be operationalized and brought into the way that the business makes decisions very easily. And our final outcome is effective partnerships. I mean, the theme of this whole talk is about how partnerships between business and academia can be really productive, but we also recognize that they have pretty unique challenges. So we're kind of building on our experience here to develop a toolbox which can be used to create and maintain these sorts of effective and sustainable partnerships. And we want to make sure that the partnerships remain beneficial to both partners. So this one doesn't have quite as cool of a graphic as the other ones we talked about, but we've developed what we're calling a knowledge partnership scorecard, which is a set of 144 metrics about what makes a successful partnership. And it can be used as a framework for when establishing partnerships, as a diagnostic tool for existing partnerships, and as a benchmarking tool if you want to assess different partnerships or compare different partnerships. We're currently beta testing it at ASU, and it's also available for any other institutions who are interested through the University Design Institute, which is part of ASU. So finally, I want to point out that this all only works, co-production of knowledge only works if there's people we're co-producing with. And CBO is really dedicated to building mutually beneficial partnerships with industry. And, so we're always looking for new partners. If somebody in the audience here is interested in working with us in any way, please reach out. If you're from the future and watching this as a recorded talk, the offer's still open. Please reach out. These are our emails. And we hope that, what we've highlighted here is kind of just the beginning of many other partnerships and a lot of knowledge co-production in the future. And I'm going to leave these emails up here for a second if anybody wants to jot them down, but that is the end of my talk. So I think now we're going to transition into Q&As.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the excellent presentation. And if I can ask the panelists to rejoin by video, I will open up the floor for discussion and questions from four panelists. I think that Chris's talk was particularly interesting because he's looking at, or one of the things we're aspiring to do with CBO is not only implement these models of co-production to achieve outcomes, but we're also studying what works and what doesn't work. And part of the goal of this webinar is to reach out to others to learn what you all are doing and how we might refine these models.
So Leah, we do have a question that came in on the Q&A chat. And I just wanted to remind everyone who's in the attendees list now that if you do have a question, you can go ahead and click on the participants button on the bottom column, the bottom bar of your screen, and that will bring up a vertical column of the attendees list. From there, you can raise your hand at the bottom of that vertical bar, and that will notify us that you have a question if you did want to join the Q&A. To start off, we have a written question from Ajay Batla. And this person says, can you give a specific example of biodiversity conservation having made a before and the after on the sustainable development goals of a company that at face value does not appear to have biodiversity affect the company's business?
Anyone want to take a stab at that? How does biodiversity conservation make good business sense?
So I'd like to relate that directly to the Sustainable Development Goals, because I think that's a really, really interesting point. The Sustainable Development Goals, the process by which we've been trying to achieve biodiversity impacts in the larger policy framework has been formulated through something called the Aichi targets, which were set up in 2010. And they were basically formulated and then implemented by governments. So the implication of the way in which the targets were framed was that it was entirely a government obligation to deliver them. And of course, we failed. We didn't achieve any of the Aichi targets in any significant way. Biodiversity has continued to decline, and we're in the mess we are at the moment. The IPBES report that came out last year says that there are about 1 million species of plant and animal that are at risk of extinction. The reason that we haven't been able to achieve what we need to achieve is because most of the money in the world is not managed directly by governments, it's managed by companies, and they are not part of that process. So what we are trying to do with our metric effort, but that's just a very small part of the wider effort to try and align the flows of money out there so that they are at least aware of what it is that biodiversity, how biodiversity reacts to the ways in which resources are produced or mined in the world. That can help those companies who are interested to be engaged to do so, to become more active members of that part, the process of delivering these global targets. And that's a really big first step towards making the whole post-2020 biodiversity framework a more participative one. I think the growing momentum now is also showing that conservation of biodiversity is incredibly material for almost everybody. There's something like $14 trillion worth of value contributed to economic activity every year by natural systems. And you just can't go around and replace that. It's something which enables all economic activity to happen. And every part of the economy, particularly places like agriculture and infrastructure and mining and other things, are so fundamentally dependent on the existence of biodiversity that you have to be able to reinvest in biodiversity in order to allow those processes to continue happening. So this is now, the framing of this, I think, is changing very rapidly, where we're getting a sense that companies are very much interested to be able to show they are being good citizens and contribute to the maintenance of biodiversity. The big problem is to show them how they can do that and how they can measure that impact. That's really what we've been trying to help them with.
Yeah, I have an example, maybe. Electric power companies, many of them manage right-of-ways. So, think of the big transmission lines that run across the landscape. And so they, I mean, obviously, or potentially when they're sort of going and building those transmission lines, maybe they took some habitat and affected some biodiversity. But, ultimately, what they are managing for is early successional habitats. They essentially just don't want trees growing within their right-of-ways. And so there's more and more sort of recognition by the electric power companies that they are potentially, depending on sort of the way they're sort of managing the right-of-ways, there's that they are actually managing for, quite a lot of sort of early successional, biodiversity. And there's a lot of research going into trying to sort of demonstrate that this idea of sort of integrated vegetation management, IVM, is actually more cost effective than, let's say broadcast spraying, along right-of-ways with, pesticides. And so there's a lot, I think there's a lot of the companies are starting to sort of understand and sort of recognize, how they are potentially sort of helping to participate in preserving some biodiversity. And there's more and more research being done to try to sort of understand, what kind of value that those place, particularly for pollinators, right? So there's a big effort around pollinators, and EPRI has a Power in Pollinators program, and is doing lots of research, on how you can more effectively manage right-of-ways to increase, pollinator diversity, along these right-of-ways. So, and a lot of that, and again, what's interesting is there's a lot of potential sort of benefits to the companies, of doing that. So that might be an example of what he was asking.
Great insights. Thank you so much, Frank and Christian. Other insights on this question about what is their evidence? What is the evidence of biodiversity being of value for the business sector? Any other insights from Laura or Chris before we move on to the next question?
I don't know if I have a specific example of that, but I do know that the paradigm around conservation does appear to be evolving. For example, in the US, you have a lot of conservation programs that are managed by the US government through state and federal programs, and farmers are used to working with those programs, and typically there's a contract involved, and or a certain commitment of time or certain, piece of land taken out of production that perhaps is along a waterway or so on. But I think now companies realize that they have to get involved and help farmers to be more sustainable, to protect biodiversity, to show them how to do that, and then also provide the services to not only help them protect biodiversity, but perhaps gain some economic benefits from doing that through carbon markets or nutrient markets or these other kinds of opportunities that are rising for farmers. And I think, farmers oftentimes are viewed in a negative way in their communities. And so this is a way that, you know, they can feel good about, you know, what they're doing and their operation, and that farms can be areas where you have good biodiversity and you have, you know, protection of waterways and soil quality and, you know, wildlife habitat. So I think sort of changing the mentality of conservation being just something that is run by the federal government or the state extension office, and having it be more of sort of a team effort between the farmer, the companies that he works with, and also those extension agents. It's I think it's evolving now. The farmers are becoming more aware.
Thank you, Laura. I often say, you know, lately that, you know, given the cost figures that I showed about how much it costs globally and in the US to avert biodiversity loss or restore endangered species, recover endangered species, that funding is certainly not coming from the government these days. And I think we're going to be increasingly needing to rely on the private sector for biodiversity conservation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also protecting farms is a great way to protect biodiversity. Once it becomes a parking lot or an apartment complex, you know, if that land goes out of agriculture, that's a negative. And so, you know, farmers are business people too, but they have a affinity to the land and keeping it as green space. And so I think things that we can do to, you know, to support farmers is also a benefit to biodiversity.
Yeah, and just to, you know, kind of add on to that a little bit, I think that, you know, one of the things I think is that you know, these groups and these entities are potentially sort of already spending money on it, and I think there's a broad, you know, they'd be willing to potentially sort of do more. And, you know, it's, you know, particularly, you know, trying to sort of find ways to incentivize private landowners to do more is something that it's an opportunity sort of being lost. And, you know, because I think that, you know, and again, for the electric power companies, the other thing we also have to think about is sometimes, you know, there's some strange incentives not to do something. So, you know, even, you know, in the US with the Endangered Species Act, I mean, there are some companies that, you know, potentially would be, you know, they're like, oh yeah, we would like to promote sort of biodiversity and maybe sort of manage for these rare and endangered species. But, you know, if it potentially sort of brings an endangered species on their land that they're managing, then all of a sudden they have, you know, increased sort of responsibility of it. So, you know, so there's a disincentive to potentially sometimes to manage in a way that is beneficial to, you know, to those companies, because in the end they might, you know, they might preclude them from being able to do something else. So, you know, it's complicated, you know, to try to address some of these issues.
I agree, it's complicated, and for the younger generations who are here with us or viewing us in the future, I think, you know, our work is cut out for us in terms of developing those incentive structures and better linking the excellent science we're doing to the decision-making world, so that there is, you know, if a company has an interest, as they say they do in these sustainability reports, well, what do they do? You know, how do they monitor? What are the indicators? How do they report? We don't really have all that dialed, and my hope is that will be our work in the next 5-10 years. I see another question. I think Suzanne is going to facilitate that.
Yeah, I want to make sure we get Logan's question because I accidentally moved it to the answered column. So I want to make sure that we get his as well.
Yes, actually, that's the question that I have. I have a question from Logan Franklin. And that question is, what do you find to be the biggest barriers in blending the more ecocentric ideals of biodiversity conservation and the more anthrocentric ideals of sustainability?
So I think this is a very interesting question because I mean, I think that this is a little bit of a misnomer, right? And that the biodiversity conservation and sustainability, the anthropocentric ideals of sustainability being human well-being are on a very fundamental level linked, because the biodiversity of our planet is essential for the continuing flourishing of our society. And so I think that the biggest barrier in getting through those is helping make those connections explicit. Make the connections between the large amounts of biodiversity to higher levels of human flourishing and human well-being. However, that's not exactly easy. I mean, the language used in those two conversations is very different. The metrics used don't line up. And we've got a long history of kind of treating these as two separate problems. Something that it kind of ties into the last question is that biodiversity is a public good, and therefore it is not well regulated by the market, which is where businesses tend to operate. However, when we think of the ideals of sustainability from an anthropocentric perspective, we tend to think about what goods we're delivering to people. Like, do they have water? Do they have do they have education? So these things that are more easily quantifiable as discrete goods are easier to talk about in a way that biodiversity isn't. So I think that a lot of the barriers here just come with finding the language that can address both, which fits into some of the things we were talking about finding tools that fit both, finding metrics that fit both. And once you have these sort of bridging tools and metrics, then the conversations can come closer and kind of merge into one. That's my take.
Thank you.
I've actually found it very useful to consider the distinction between the two in terms of risk. I think risk is a thing that people understand intuitively from the business perspective, but also from the sort of social angle. People are extremely good at assessing risk and making decisions based on risk. So if you can frame how it is that the loss of biodiversity presents a risk to people, or to companies, or to the finance sector in particular, that tends to be a way in which you can enable people to act. You can enable people to make decisions if you're enabling them to understand how it is that changes in the status of biodiversity presents a risk to them. There's lots of different ways in the private sector where that might happen, and one of the ones that has actually been very effective in changing corporate behavior is the perception of reputational risk, where companies don't want to be seen to be doing the wrong thing. And as soon as it's pointed out to them that they are doing the wrong thing, they're digging up biodiversity-rich habitats or whatever it might be, the pressure is on them from shareholders or from the general public to change that behavior. Now, I think the more recent tendency has been that there's a great deal more appreciation of the financial risk. And that's really going to make things very, very different for the private sector world when it's suddenly part of their bottom line. So one of the things that we're doing, for instance, is to helping the finance industry explain to companies why it is that, because they haven't assessed their exposure to biodiversity-related risk properly, that the finance companies are going to change the cost of capital for them. And then it suddenly becomes extremely evident why it is that a company should react to biodiversity-related risk, because it's going to cost them more money. That can really change behavior very fast.
That sounds really promising, Frank. How far away do you think we are from getting to the point where that can be operationalized? That's going to be a game changer.
Yes, absolutely. So there is something called the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosure, TFND, I think is the quick abbreviation that it goes under at the moment, which is basically looking to legislate for companies to be obliged to disclose the degree of their financial dependency, their dependency on biodiversity. Now, there are lots of tricky issues to resolve before that can happen, but there's lots of companies trying to figure out to get get in front of that. And in particular, the risk assessment companies who want to be able to help investors evaluate the extent to which investee companies are exposed to risk. We're working with quite a lot of them to figure out whether we can use the STAR metric I was talking about earlier as a measure of the extent to which companies are exposed to biodiversity related risk. And that can then go into this disclosure process that I was talking about earlier. And then you have a framework that can govern the way it is that massive amounts of money flow through the economic system, that recognizes finally why it is you should not be destroying biodiversity as part of your economic activity.
Wonderful.
So,
thank you, Frank. Go ahead, Suzanne.
We do have another question. This is from Stefan, and Stefan says, really interesting example on right-of-ways, Christian. Laura, I was wondering how Bayer is acting to reduce the impacts of crop protection, and does this help Bayer's bottom line?
Yes, so the idea around reducing the impact of crop protection is bringing together all of the new science with respect to sustainable agriculture, and using all of the tools, precision agriculture, remote sensing, all precision applications, and the ability to be very precise in how you use crop protection, and then also using the ability to understand areas of a certain field where you're getting very poor yields, to where you could take that area of the field out of production completely, but actually raise your bottom line as a farmer, even though you're taking certain land out of production. That has the effect of decreasing overall usage of crop protection chemicals while maintaining yields. And so moving away from just seeing how many acres, of application of our product are we selling, but moving to more of a services model for farmers that balances their need for high yields, and also the need to protect the surrounding environments and biodiversity. And so that's how we're looking at trying to achieve these reductions. Also continuing to develop more and more safe and safer crop protection chemicals as we go forward into the future. Understanding that we work in a highly regulated industry, and it takes many years to introduce new products on the market. But at the same time, you have, very fast advances in precision agriculture tools, equipment that farmers have to use on the field, things like drones and robots, and these other kinds of things are going to come online that will help farmers, and also, reduce exposure to wildlife and to even, farm workers, for example.
I'll have to jump in and add to that, because we're actually, CBO is actually working with Bayer on this topic particularly, and getting a handle on how to mitigate and manage risk associated with pesticides for endangered species. And this is a vexing problem, because there are, thousands of listed species and thousands of different types of chemicals. Well, not thousands, hundreds. And so how do you proceed with permitting for pesticides when you don't have the data? And the federal agencies involved and the private industry has sort of been at a stalemate in this, because it's such a vexing problem. And so we're sort of trying to approach this from mapping out where the decisions are happening between the agencies and where the regulatory hurdles are, and then looking at what is the value of information, which information do we need first, and how does this information impact the decision process, so that it can be a little bit more, I guess, transparent, and also less onerous for both federal agencies and the companies, while we seek to minimize impact to endangered species. So that's my 2 cents on that, having been working with Bear for the last couple of years on this project.
Yeah, I think giving regulators the certainty that they're protecting these endangered species, and but also giving industry a way to move forward, so they're just not in this continuous log jam and not knowing what's coming up. So I think that's the value, hopefully, to everyone in working on this project, is just finding a path forward that can be a win-win for the farmers and for the regulators, and for industry, and hopefully for biodiversity and endangered species.
Fantastic. I am not seeing additional questions. Did any of the panelists have input on the questions that have been raised thus far?
It's been a good discussion.
It sure has. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar, and it certainly went much smoother than our actual live seminar for the UN conference last week. So I'm very, very grateful to the panelists for taking the time to join us today, and a special thanks to CBO's operations team, Suzanne and Anayi, for making this happen smoothly today. So be well, everyone, take care, and hopefully this panel will trigger some inspiration on how we can better work together to achieve the biodiversity outcomes that we're all passionate about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Leah. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.